31 mice gone in 3 days for $4. The Amish bucket method. That catches 30 overnight. You hear it again when the house goes still. That thin scratching inside the wall near the kitchen floor. Not loud, not urgent, just steady enough to keep you awake. You tell yourself it's nothing until the flour bag shifts in the morning. Just a little. And you know, it's not one anymore. Out in the barn, there's a plain bucket sitting under a dim light. Nothing special about it. The kind you've had for years, forgotten behind feed sacks. Yet someone once said that bucket, set the right way, can change a whole winter. No poison, no fancy traps, just a setup most people overlook. And the strange part is this number that gets repeated quietly. 30 in one night. You don't believe it yet. That's the point. Something simple is about to feel suspiciously powerful. Before we go further, I'm curious what your nights sound like right now. Not the quiet ones, the ones where something small keeps tapping at the edge of the walls. Share it honestly, even if it feels minor. And if stories like this feel familiar, you're in the right kind of place here. No noise, no pressure, just old ways that still deserve a second look when life gets complicated. The first night never feels like a problem. It feels like a mistake. A loose board, a pipe cooling down, something simple you can ignore if you try hard enough. You lie there listening, telling yourself the house is just settling the way old houses do. But the sound keeps returning, soft as pencil marks behind the wall near the kitchen corner. Not urgent, just persistent enough to change how you breathe. You get up once. Stand in the dark, listen. Nothing moves while you are paying attention. That's how it always works. The silence feels rehearsed, like it's waiting for you to go back to bed before it continues. And you do go back, because that's what people do when they don't want a small thing to become a big one too early. In the morning, the kitchen looks the same at first glance, but it never really is. A flour bag tilted slightly where it wasn't before. A crumb trail near the baseboard that wasn't there yesterday. You tell yourself it's just one. One mouse doesn't feel like a failure. It feels manageable, still in your control, still something you can outlast with a trap or two. That's where most people stay for too long. Because what follows isn't dramatic at first, it's slow. A kind of quiet rearranging of what normal looks like in your own house. You start noticing small disappearances, a bit of grain here, a corner of bread there, nothing enough to prove anything. Just enough to make you suspicious of your own memory. And that suspicion is worse than certainty. A neighbor once told me something I didn't understand at the time. He said, if you see one in the open, there were already more you didn't see. He wasn't trying to scare me. He said it like he was talking about weather, something that comes whether you agree with it or not. That same neighbor is the one who mentioned it first, the bucket method, not as a trick. More like a habit people used when they stopped trusting the store-bought answers. He didn't explain it fully, just said, I don't buy traps anymore. I let the bucket handle it. Then he went back to fixing his fence like the sentence didn't matter. It should have sounded ridiculous. It almost did. Because modern thinking tells you problems need precision. One trap per mouse. One solution per symptom. That's how everything is sold now. Clean. Individual, replaceable. But a house doesn't work that way. A house is not a list of separate problems. It's a system of habits, cracks, food, warmth, and movement you don't notice until something else starts living inside it. And once that thought settles in, the whole problem feels different. Not like an invasion anymore. More like a pattern you accidentally allowed. That's when people usually start buying things. Snap traps, poison packets, little electronic boxes that promise silence through vibration or sound you can't hear. Each one feels like progress at first. Each one works just long enough to keep hope alive. Then it fades again. And the scratching returns as steady as before. It's not that nothing works. It's that nothing feels finished. And that's where frustration starts to settle deeper than the mice ever could. Because you begin to feel managed instead of helped. Like you are feeding a cycle you never agreed to. Buy, place, wait, repeat. Every solution asking for another purchase, another try, another weekend lost to the same corners of the house. There's a reason older folks didn't talk that way. They didn't describe problems as battles. They described them as conditions, things you adjust for, things you design around. My grandfather used to say, you don't argue with what keeps coming back. You change what lets it in. He wasn't talking about mice at the time. He was talking about doors that didn't close right, but it fits too well to ignore. And somewhere in that way of thinking, the bucket starts to make a different kind of sense. Not as a miracle, not as a trick, but as something built around behavior instead of force. Still, I didn't believe it yet. I only had questions. The kind that stick in your head while you're walking through a barn and noticing how many corners a small animal can hide inside without ever being seen. The kind that make you stop for a second longer than you meant to. And that's when I finally saw it again. That plain bucket, sitting under the dim light, waiting like it already knew something I didn't. It wasn't doing anything at first glance. That's what made it hard to respect. A plain bucket, scuffed at the rim, the kind you'd use for feed or washing tools. Sitting under the barn light like it had been forgotten mid-task. I remember standing there longer than I should have, waiting for it to explain itself. Nothing moved. No sound. Just that quiet certainty barns have when they've held the same objects longer than you've been paying attention to them. The neighbor didn't call it a trick. He called it letting them make their own mistake. That was all he said at first. No diagrams, no excitement, just a nod toward the barn corner like it was obvious. The way he explained it later was simple enough to miss the point if you weren't careful. Mice don't need to be chased, he said. They only need a path that feels normal enough to follow twice. That's when the rest of it started to show itself. The bucket wasn't standing alone. It was paired with a narrow plank, or sometimes a strip of wood, leaned up like a slow, inviting ramp. Something they could climb without thinking. Not steep, not suspicious. Just enough of an angle to feel like part of their usual movement, through a space they already believed they owned. At the top there was usually bait, not much, a small piece of grain or something with a smell that carried further than it looked. Enough to pull curiosity forward without forcing it. That part matters more than people think. Because the goal isn't to surprise the animal. It's to let it continue what it already started doing in its own mind. Moving forward, exploring, following a path that feels like nothing new at all. Once inside the barn, you start to see the logic differently. These animals don't calculate danger the way we do. They don't step back and weigh consequences. They follow edges, walls, shadows, the same routes again and again because repetition feels safe. That's why a setup like this works at all. It doesn't fight their instincts. It quietly redirects them. One mouse follows the ramp without hesitation. That part is almost predictable. But what changes everything is what happens after that first moment disappears into the bucket. The sound, if you hear it at all, is small enough to miss if you're not listening for it. A soft drop, not dramatic. Just enough to mark a mistake that can't be undone, and the barn goes quiet again, like nothing happened at all. Then something else begins. The scent trail, the movement pattern. Whatever pulls the next one forward isn't awareness, it's continuity. Another mouse arrives, follows the same route, makes the same assumption, and then another. It becomes less like a trap and more like a repeating habit inside a place that never interrupts its own rhythm. That's the part most people don't expect. Not the first catch, but the stacking effect. The way repetition builds on itself when nothing stops the pattern. In a single night, if conditions are right, it doesn't behave like a one-at-a-time solution. It behaves like a loop, quiet, mechanical, uninterested in fairness or timing. Just continuation until the movement slows down on its own. Still, it's not magic, and it's not universal. That's important to say clearly. If there's food left out everywhere, or if entry points aren't controlled, or if the barn or kitchen is already fully open to them, no bucket method becomes a miracle. It's not a cure for neglect. It's a response to patterns already in motion. That's where people sometimes misunderstand it and expect too much. The placement matters more than the idea. Corners where movement already happens. Walls where shadows collect. Places where you've already seen signs before you ever set anything down. And even then, it's not about domination. It's about interruption. A quiet interruption of something that was already repeating whether you noticed it or not. By the time you step back from it, the bucket doesn't look impressive. That's the strange part. It never earns visual respect. No flashing parts. No sound. No confirmation that anything is working until much later. It just sits there, doing something that feels almost too simple to trust. And yet, in the right conditions, it changes the rhythm of a space in a way more expensive tools never quite manage. I remember standing there that night longer than I meant to, not because I was convinced, because I wasn't. And that uncertainty has a way of keeping you watching, waiting for proof to argue with itself. The barn didn't offer any answers. Only the quiet suggestion that something ordinary had been doing this longer than I had been doubting it. And that's where the real shift happens, not in what the bucket is, but in what you start noticing about everything around it. The patterns you ignored before, the movement you dismissed, the small signals that were never small at all once you finally decide to see them differently. And what comes next is the part nobody really explains right away. What happens when you refine it, and why some people swear it changes the entire feeling of a house in ways they didn't expect at all. There's a point where you stop thinking about the bucket as an object. It becomes something else. A quiet recorder of what the house has been doing without you noticing. You only understand that shift after the second night. The barn air was colder that evening, the kind of cold that settles into wood before it reaches skin. I walked in without expecting anything different. That's usually how it goes. You don't expect change from something that looks this simple. But the bucket sounded different before I even saw it. Not loud, never loud, just a change in rhythm. A reminder that the house is not as still as it pretends to be when you're asleep. That's when you understand the first part of the method most people miss. It's not about the bucket catching one mouse. It's about what happens when movement keeps repeating inside a place that never resets itself. One comes down the ramp because nothing has told it not to. Another follows because nothing has broken the pattern. And then something subtle happens. The space stops being explored and starts being used. That's where repetition takes over. Not intelligence, not planning, just continuity. It's uncomfortable to realize how much of nature runs on that alone. I stood there a long time that night, not counting, not interfering, just listening in the way you listen when you don't want to admit something is working without your permission. There's a sound mice make when they stop treating a space like unfamiliar territory. It's not panic, it's routine. And routine is what makes the system scale. But I need to say this clearly because this is where people overreach the idea. It doesn't always look like the stories. Some nights it's nothing. Some setups fail completely because something simpler is wrong. Food left elsewhere. A gap too big in a wall. A scent trail leading somewhere better than your bucket ever could be. This method is not stronger than a house that is still feeding the problem elsewhere. It only works when the rest of the environment isn't competing against it. That honesty matters more than the method itself. Still, when it does line up, you see why older folks kept things like this around without making a big deal about it. No pride in it, no talk, just another tool that worked quietly when needed. And yes, sometimes the numbers people repeat come from nights where everything aligned. But that's not something you promise. It's something you notice when you're patient enough to stop expecting instant results. There's another part people rarely mention. It changes how you look at the house itself. Because once you've seen movement collected instead of scattered, you start noticing where the movement begins. A loose corner behind the pantry, a bag left open longer than it should have been, a wall gap you walked past 100 times without thinking it mattered. The bucket doesn't solve those things, it reveals them. That's the uncomfortable truth. It shows you what the house was already allowing, and that realization is usually more important than anything that ends up inside it. I remember thinking that night that the real shift wasn't control, it was awareness, the kind you don't get from buying better tools, the kind you get when something simple forces you to see the pattern instead of the symptom. Still, there was one moment I didn't expect. A pause in the pattern, not silence exactly, just absence of continuation, like the system had finally exhausted the path it had been repeating. And in that pause, you feel something you don't get from traps or poison or anything mechanical that demands constant replacement. You feel done, not because everything is perfect, but because something stopped repeating itself. That's where most people finally understand why this idea stayed around for so long without becoming a product you see on a shelf. It doesn't scale well as a purchase. It doesn't need upgrades. It doesn't invite dependency. It just sits inside a system and interrupts it long enough for you to notice what was already happening. By morning, the barn looked the same as it always did. But I didn't, because now I was watching differently, and that's the part nobody sells you. Not the bucket, not the method, the attention it forces back into your own hands. And once you have that, the question stops being whether it works and starts becoming what else in your house has been repeating quietly without you noticing all along. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels earned. You notice it first in small ways. The night doesn't sound different at the beginning. It just stops asking you to listen as hard. That's what surprised me most. Because after a few days of paying attention to the bucket, something else starts happening in the house itself. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow return to what you remember as normal before you started questioning every corner and shadow. But here's the part nobody likes to hear at first. The bucket isn't the real fix, it never was. It only exposes what was already out of balance. If the house is still offering food where it shouldn't, they'll find it. If gaps stay open, they'll use them. If the edges of the kitchen stay warm and hidden, nothing really changes long term. That's why older farmers didn't talk about solutions the way we do now. They talked about maintenance, about habits, about what a house invites without meaning to. My grandfather used to walk through a room once without saying anything, then touch a corner board and say, "That's where it starts." No explanation needed. He didn't mean mice specifically. He meant weakness. Small openings in the way things are kept. The bucket, in that sense, is not a weapon. It's feedback. And once you understand that, everything about it changes. You stop thinking in terms of catching. You start thinking in terms of, why is anything here at all? There's a discipline in that kind of thinking that modern fixes don't really ask from you. Modern fixes are designed to remove attention. Buy this. Place that, wait, replace when it stops working. But simple methods, old methods, pull attention back into the space itself, into crumbs you didn't notice, into gaps behind storage bins, into doors that almost close all the way, and that's where real control starts. Not in elimination, in awareness. Now, I want to be honest about something that matters more than the method itself. This won't solve every situation. If the problem has already spread deep into walls, insulation, or storage spaces that stay untouched, a bucket alone won't reset the whole house. It becomes one part of a wider correction, not the entire answer. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling certainty where there isn't any. But in the right conditions, when the movement is still near the surface, still following predictable paths, it can shift the rhythm of a space faster than people expect. Not because it's powerful. Because it's simple enough to work with behavior instead of against it. That's the quiet difference. A few nights after everything settled, I remember standing in the kitchen and realizing I wasn't listening anymore. Not scanning, not waiting, just standing. That feeling is rare now. Most homes don't give it easily. We fill them with too many fixes, too many devices, too many partial answers that keep the problem in rotation. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside something as plain as a bucket. Sometimes the goal isn't to out-engineer a problem. It's to interrupt the pattern long enough for the house to return to itself. There's a kind of pride that comes with that. Not loud pride. Quiet. The kind you don't talk about unless someone else has lived it too. So I'll leave you with this instead of a summary. If your house has been repeating the same small problems, same scratching, same signs, same frustration, it might not be asking for something complicated. It might just be asking for attention in the right places. And sometimes the simplest tools don't look like solutions at all until you realize they were never meant to impress you. They were meant to make you notice what you stopped seeing. If you've dealt with this kind of thing before, mice, noise, that slow feeling of something moving where it shouldn't, I'd be curious how it showed up in your home, not the theory. The real moment you realized it was there. People learn from that more than anything else. And if there's one thing worth carrying forward from all of this, it's that old habits of keeping a house quiet never really disappeared. They just stopped being talked about. And maybe that's the part worth bringing back. Next time, there's another simple barn habit that most people forgot. Something to do with keeping stored food untouched through the colder months without buying anything new. But that's a quieter story for another night.